Well, hello, friends. We get to talk about friendship today, what I like to call a deep value. There's these other values we often discuss and things that have built up to this. You know already that welcome is super important to me. It's one that I bring up often. We think about hospitality within that. We think about unity. We think about all these different things that seem to be a little more external and bringing people in. But somehow, friendship is next level. You and I both know the longer that you live, the more experience in life you have, the harder it is to define, but also truly put a measure on what friendship is. There's something about friends. We talk often about, in other circles, we talk about the whole idea of a loneliness epidemic, about this whole idea of how adults especially have a really hard time making new friends the further into life they go. The idea of having lifelong friends, but that group of friends getting smaller and smaller, less people you trust, or maybe there's not as many of them. And begs the question, if we see that as a value, that friendship is actually a value, then how do you express a value like that? How do you measure it? How do you say this is something that we find important, but we also want to build that into others and share that with others so they understand that ultimately we desire people to be friends? There's something bigger about that, right? There's something about friendship that it's just deeper, because when we think about friends and we just use it as a common term, we realize that not everyone is in the same space with that, right? Well, let's look at the passage even that I picked for this Sunday. We often think about the 1 Corinthians 13 as being the love chapter, right? You think about the love chapter and you consider how often this comes up for weddings. I can't tell you how many weddings I've done where the couple picks 1 Corinthians 13 as their passage. And oftentimes I wonder if they've actually read the entire chapter or even the context of the chapter. Most of the time not. Well, why? Because they've seen it in a Hallmark card, or they've only read maybe verses 1 to 3, maybe even have gone so far as 1 through 7. And they have more of the descriptors of what love is and what love isn't. But have they read the rest of it? In context, obviously it's part of a bigger letter. You know, the Corinthian church, we often say, had a lot of the same problems we have today. A lot of human issues, a lot of social issues, spiritual issues, personal issues, all of the above, things that would cause breakdown in a group that commits to wanting to gather, worship, and share together, and to live out Christ and to help others to do so in a body format. And of course, that leads us to 1 Corinthians 12, which is right before this chapter. And it's famous because it's the body chapter, right? It's about all the spiritual gifts and about how the gifts are knitted together to form the body. And then after chapter 13, you have chapter 14. And chapter 14, of course, is almost a little bit about some of the distractions in worship and what gifts should be at the top, so to speak, and maybe some that should just be at home. And you might even say there's a bit of worship wars and issues that come up with chapter 14. So it's not by accident that chapter 13 comes right in the midst of talking about the actual body growing together, people that choose to spend all this time together to worship, to see themselves as different, to invite others into it, but then also express what it means to be part of this everywhere you go. And so that makes it more than welcome, makes it more than unity, hospitality, all the different things. It becomes a deeper level thing about how do we just keep going with what we are and who we are and make it deeper. Well, we use the word friendship for that. And love, well, love is really what's being described here and as the essence of it. And so you have to start with the end of chapter 12, where you see 12 verse 31, where he says there's something more excellent, right? And then he talks about love. He talks about that this is the basis for everything that we do. And The question that I throw out to people all the time, well, a lot anyways, let's say a lot, especially in church circles where the friendship idea can be difficult because we're not sure how deep or how shallow things are in different relationships. A lot of shoulds get used where people are supposed to be acting appropriately, but what does that even mean? And so I ask people, how many friends can you actually have? Use whatever definition you have for friendship, but how many friends can you actually have? It's a tough one. Well, some social scientists have done work with that, and you may have seen these numbers before. They come up quite often when we talk about grouping. What does it mean to actually be a part of a group, and how big of a group is too big of a group? And the reality is, and this especially came up because of studies done on social media, the impact of social media, the whole idea of, do we actually have a social network, or is it just a gallery, or is it just a place that we go to vent and not really know the people that we're venting to or about? And so one of the things that you'll find is that 150 is kind of the cap. If you have a church of over 150 people, the people you actually sort of know by extension, and you can say, well, I think I'm connected with those people, maxes out at 150. And they ran these numbers again and again to see, does this change in any context? No, not really. People with better memories or being able to latch on to different identifying markers of different people, well, they might think that they have a bigger group than 150, but actually 150 is still where it caps off. They might just know facts about other people. So what actually ends up happening at 150, if you go beyond that, you start subtracting. And so some of the people that are part of the original 150 get removed. And this is where you have it where you might see somebody at a store and you're like, I should know who that person is. But they're out of that memory log. They're no longer in it. And so they're recognizable, but they're not part of this, the bigger group. And then you drop down to 50 and you might say, okay, well, 50, that's almost manageable. And 50 is where, they might be colleagues. There might be some level of depth, but they're not necessarily sharing your heart. They're closer. You think of a group like you're in and you go, well, yeah, we know each other pretty well. You're right. You're kind of within that 50 range. But then they find that there's another number. 10 seems to be the maximum. This is what many call a true friendship group, the group that knows you intimately. People are communicating freely with one another, and there's a sense of wanting to persevere and also protect within that group. So usually I say people max out at around 8 when we talk about actual intimate friendship. So when we talk about friendship as a value, we have to recognize, well, what number and how are we including people into that group? So that was kind of the basis for a lot of small group ministry for years and years. It's the whole idea of, well, you have too many people in one space, you're less likely to share with them. So when we talk about wanting people to be friends and build some kind of a friendship with us, we're talking about how we want all those other values to somehow feed into this and build into it. And we have to then recognize that we may not be close friends with everyone, but we want everyone to have a close friend. Does that make sense? We somehow want it to be that the other values feed into this thing where we are actually caring and loving for an individual, but also as a part of the group. So friendship acts that way. It acts as some kind of like I said, it's the deep one, it's the middle, and that these other things feed into it. So I mentioned before about the whole idea of a more excellent way. That's how the NRSV talks about the idea of love. That this whole chapter is based on that introduction from 1231. You might remember from John 15 that Jesus says that there's no greater sign of love, no bigger thing you can do than a friend, someone who lays down their life for a friend. Something about that, right? There's a sacrificial aspect to love. That it becomes a more excellent way. It's visible. We know when someone truly cares and when someone wants to actually see the best in you, and you see the best in them. And you feed into that. You don't want somebody to not feel like a friend. That brings us to the first list. So when I do this as part of a wedding, I always find this part interesting because a lot of the statements that are made in verses 1 through 3, they're not statements. It's not like this. It's not that. It's not whatever. You get it. It's not. So what is it not? Well, you'll realize that that list of things that it is not are all things that are, you might say, they're praisable. They're things that I can watch somebody do and say, well, they create status. They make a person stand out. We talk about noise. We talk about singing. We talk about all these different parts that people will seek after or hear or notice. And it says, well, love's not those things. It's more than that. So when we talk about this idea of an attainable love, and if we're using friendship as our basis, then you have it where you walk into a setting, you're not necessarily noticing friendship, so to speak. You're noticing these other things that people will often put in front of themselves to pump up, to puff up. The other people will say, okay, wow, that's the smartest guy in the room. And he's saying, if you're holding on to being the smartest guy in the room, well, are you loving? If you're holding on to being whatever it is that you see as a status symbol, are you actually loving? Well, love isn't those things. I call that next part, there's a couple of different ways you can say it. I often say visible, but action. So love is an activity. There's a decision being made that we love. And this list, verses 4 through 7, they have no's and yeses as well, right? That they're actionable things. Like when we think about love being kind, for instance, when we think about it not holding wrongs or holding faults, think about how often you've had a grudge with someone. Think about how often somebody ticked you off that is not just out there, but they're closer to you, and how long that sticks. You notice that the closer they are to you, the more that you've given them your heart, the more that you've made a risk of love with them, that you've allowed them into your space, the easier it is to hold on to things that can be hurtful or things that don't line up exactly with the way you see life. You have a difference of opinion, and all of a sudden, it's a fault that breaks relationships down. We see that all the time. I know of friends that have no longer been friends. I know of people that have had situations where there was one falling out and a decades-long relationship just ended. And so when we think about love in this way, we're thinking about that there is some kind of action in place. It's visible. We know it. We can say that we don't have a good definition for love, but when we look at what's happening here, we can say, yeah, those are all areas that I as a person will struggle with in every area of life, or I could struggle with them in every area of life. They're all things that I'll trip over. And when we talk about it, that these are attributes as well as things that we want to stay away from, that those are the things that are visible and make it easier for the next person to love us. Well, then those are things that we want to aspire to. Those become definitions. Those are a part of any deep relationship that you are a part of. The next section of verses, it gets a little, I don't know. I don't want to say cloudy, but it gets up there somewhere. And you can imagine in a wedding how it all of a sudden changes the whole tone when you have a reader who's been instructed to not stop at verse 7, but go on through verses 8 through 12. And all of a sudden you have the reader standing up there, and it's like, oh, I see partially or I see dimly, and it's someday it'll be complete, someday it'll be this. And those are all promises. Those are all like, you're now in the temporal zone, but at some point you'll see eternal. And what happens is, the reason that people get into that state is because, and they're not sure, do we keep reading, is because those are big statements about the whole picture of eternity in Christ. And it moves away from being just, well, these are feelings I can have. These are things I can work on. These are things that I can see in others, and I can admit when I've done wrong, and okay, yeah, I get that. But then all of a sudden talking about that it's incomplete, but we're waiting for the fullness. That I look into a mirror and it's not quite the recognizable image, but someday I'll see with clarity as though face to face. Well, that really changes things because it's a bigger perspective. It's the idea of being incomplete. It's the idea that we are still broken and we're still stumbling through this. That there are moments where we push as hard as we can and we say, I want to work on these things and I see that I need work in those areas. And we ask God to intervene. We say, I'm living in you. Please teach me. Please show me. But then we ask that of other people. Help me in this. That's why I have the whole not yet. Because he's talking about something bigger. He's talking about the idea of being perfected. The idea that we are, as part of friendship, we're actually growing within that. And so we keep going with it. That's why it's so important that this chapter ends off the way it does. Because he ends off with love. You know, the greatest of these is love. When you think about faith, hope, and love, you realize, wow, these are the basis for everything that we're talking about. These are the things that we see Christ in. And so when we're helping one another, when we're learning how to love, when we're learning how to go deeper, we're trying. And we keep trying because we're going to be spurned on in different ways than we have ever been before. Where all of a sudden we have this sense of conviction about stuff that was never there before. And we go, okay, how do I lean into that? How do I get others to help me lean into that? How do I help someone who's mentioned, I struggle with this, I want someone to walk with. I don't know how yet, but we need more. Well, I call it trying in that way, and maybe trying isn't the best word. But there's something about being able to lean into that and say, this is more about a journey than it is an arrival point. Paul does describe that. Yes, have the eternal future hope. But in living as you are, how is love the more excellent way? How does it exist in a way that is counter to so many counterfeit things? What does it look like? That's when we show or can show the depth of relationship where people may still get hurt, may still stumble, but you're walking together in it. Something more comes out of that. So the question I often leave when I go into all kinds of different spaces and I think to myself, what is the right question? Well, the question that comes up often is, are you friendly or are you looking for friendship? Now, when we think about welcome as a value, we often go back to it and say, yeah, we need to be friendly. And we'll force people to be friendly. You know, I do it myself. We all know that when we're greeting someone or if we're trying to make a good impression, we are friendly. We want to show that it's safe, it's warm, it's inviting. Look at this. Hey, I'm a safe person. I want you to come hang out with me. Those are all friendly things. But the reality is, in many spaces, especially as you have more and more people, you have to ask yourself, what does friendship look like? Am I offering friendship? Or am I just offering one space once a week for people to be friendly? And the reality is, the kingdom is about friendship. It is family, but it is also using friendship language. And it happens all over Scripture, where there is something about the community of God being together, growing deeper, and wanting to be loved, but also show love. And that's something you have to foster, and you have to lean into and grow into to help others see it, but also to grow in it yourself. So, it's a deep value. Are you seeking out ways to build friendship? Or you just want people to be friendly?